My family howled when Dad toasted that I merely take up space, unaware that this space was now a sanctuary 3,000 miles away. They dismissed my retort as impulsive, never suspecting it was the calculated finale of a plan hatched in a garage. My new table doesn't just offer a seat. It forces the man who always commanded the head to sit across from me, sign his name, and finally look the invisible daughter in the eye. My name is Talia Monroe, and for the last 32 years, I have been an expert at making myself small. I learned early on that in the Monroe household, oxygen was a finite resource, and my brother Brandon consumed about 90% of it. The remaining 10% was reserved for my father's ego, leaving my mother and me to survive on the carbon dioxide they exhaled. The dining room in Maple Grove, Ohio, smelled exactly as it had every fourth Thursday of November, for as long as I could remember. It was a thick, suffocating blend of overcooked turkey, sage stuffing, and aggressive floor polish. The air was hot, not from the oven, but from the sheer friction of too many bodies pretending to like each other in a room that felt increasingly like a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. I sat where I always sat, the corner. It was technically part of the main dining table, but the geography was distinct. My father, Greg Monroe, sat at the head, commanding the view of the entire spread. To his right sat Brandon, the 35-year-old former high school quarterback who still wore his varsity jacket mentality like a second skin. Even if the jacket itself no longer buttoned comfortably, my mother, Elaine, sat to Dad's left, poised to refill his wine glass before the bottom was even visible. And then there was me. I was wedged between my 8-year-old nephew, who was currently using a dinner roll as a projectile weapon, and my 6-year-old niece, who had spilled cranberry sauce on my sleeve 3 minutes after we sat down. At 32, with a master's degree and a career that demanded high-level strategic thinking, I was still seated in the demilitarized zone reserved for children and the unmarried. The noise was deafening. Forks scraped against china, a sound that always set my teeth on edge. Brandon was recounting a story about a golf game he had played last weekend, his voice booming, projecting to the back row of an invisible stadium. Dad was nodding, his eyes gleaming with that vicarious pride that always made my stomach turn. He chewed his turkey methodically, his gaze locked on his son. "So I told the guy," Brandon shouted, gesturing with a forkful of mashed potatoes, "if you want to play in the big leagues, you have to swing like you own the grass." Dad slapped the table. The silverware jumped. "That is it. That is exactly it. Ownership, Brandon. That is what separates the men from the boys." Mom smiled tightly, her eyes flicking to the centerpiece as if checking for dust. She never looked at me. If she looked at me, she might have to acknowledge that I was sitting with my elbows tucked into my ribs to avoid knocking over a sippy cup, eating a meal I had helped cook but was barely allowed to enjoy. Then came the tapping. Dad picked up his spoon and tapped it against his crystal wine glass. Cling, cling, cling. The room did not go silent immediately. It took a second tap, louder this time, for the chatter to die down. My nephew froze with his roll in midair. Aunt Beatrice stopped chewing. Everyone shifted their bodies toward the head of the table, a magnetic pull that we were all powerless to resist. This was the ritual, the Greg Monroe Thanksgiving toast. I felt a familiar coldness settle in my chest. Every year, this toast was a performance review disguised as a blessing. Dad stood up. He smoothed his vest over his stomach. He looked flushed, partly from the red wine, but mostly from the intoxicating rush of having a captive audience. "Another year," he began, his voice dropping an octave to simulate gravitas. "We have so much to be thankful for. I look around this table, and I see the fruits of my labor. I see a roof over our heads that I paid for. I see food on the table that I provided." He paused for effect. We were expected to nod. We nodded. "I see family," he continued, his eyes resting warmly on Brandon. "You know, raising kids is not a science. It is an art. You throw your heart and soul into it, and you hope for a masterpiece." He raised his glass higher, gesturing toward my brother. "Brandon, you just closed that deal in Dayton. Fantastic work. A provider. A leader. That is the Monroe legacy right there. Brandon grinned, feigning modesty by looking down, though his chest puffed out. Thanks, Dad. Then, Dad's eyes moved. They slid past Mom, past the cousins, and landed on me. The warmth evaporated from his face. It was subtle, barely a twitch of the muscle in his jaw. But I saw it. I had spent a lifetime studying Greg Monroe's micro-expressions in order to survive them. His eyes were flat, bored, disappointed. And of course, he said, his tone shifting from pride to a sort of weary tolerance, we have everyone else. He chuckled, a dry sound. You know, I was telling the guys at the club the other day, parenting is a gamble. Some kids, they go out there and they make you proud. They build things. They carry the name. He paused again. The silence in the room stretched thin, like a rubber band about to snap. And then, he grinned, looking directly at me, some kids just take up space. It happened in slow motion. First, the silence held for a split second. Then, Brandon let out a short, sharp bark of laughter. That was the signal. The tension broke, and the table erupted. Aunt Beatrice giggled, covering her mouth with a napkin. My cousin Mike snorted into his beer. Even Mom let out a nervous, breathy laugh, her eyes darting between Dad and her plate, desperate to be on the right side of the joke. "Oh, Greg, you are terrible," someone said, but the tone was indulgent, not critical. "Take up space," Brandon repeated, shaking his head. Classic. I felt the blood drain from my face. My heart did not race. It dropped. It felt like a stone plummeting down a well, hitting the bottom of my stomach with a sickening thud. I sat there, the laughter washing over me, a physical wave of humiliation. He had said it. He had finally said the quiet part out loud. All those years of being overlooked, of being the backup plan, of having my achievements filed away in drawers while Brandon's were framed on walls. It all boiled down to this. I was mass without purpose. I was volume without value. I was just occupying square footage in Greg Monroe's world. My hands were trembling under the table. I clenched them into fists, digging my fingernails into my palms until the sharp sting grounded me. Do not cry, I told myself. Do not give him the satisfaction of a tear. Do not give him the pleasure of a red face. I looked around the table. They were all looking at me now, waiting. They wanted to see if I would take the bait. They wanted the drama. They wanted the pouting daughter so they could roll their eyes and say I was too sensitive, just like always. I took a breath. It was shallow, but it was enough. I reached for my water glass. My movements were deliberate, almost robotic. I lifted the glass to my lips and took a slow, measured sip. The water was lukewarm, but it washed away the bile rising in my throat. I set the glass down. It made a soft clink on the coaster. I looked up. I did not look at Brandon. I did not look at Mom. I locked eyes with my father. "That is funny, Dad," I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the lingering laughter like a razor through silk. The laughter died down, replaced by a confused murmur. "Because," I continued, keeping my voice steady, completely void of the emotion that was currently incinerating my insides, "it is lucky that I just built a table of my own 3,000 miles away." The silence that followed was different from the silence before the toast. This was not anticipatory. This was stunned. It was the silence of a vacuum, sucking the air out of the room. The fork that Aunt Beatrice had been raising to her mouth hovered in midair. The kids stopped kicking each other under the table. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. Dad blinked. His smile faltered, the corners of his mouth twitching as he tried to process whether I had just made a joke or declared war. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in years. He was searching for the punchline, for the apology, for the submission. He found none of it. "A table?" Cousin Mike asked, his voice loud in the quiet room. "What kind of table?" I turned my gaze to Mike, offering him a small, polite smile that did not reach my eyes. "Just a table," I said softly. I did not explain. I did not tell them about the studio in California. I did not tell them about the schematics, the sawdust, the late nights, the smell of fresh lumber and possibility. I did not tell them that the table I built had legs of steel and a surface of reclaimed oak, and that it was designed specifically so that no one could sit at the head, because it was a circle. I let the sentence hang there, suspended in the air between the turkey and the mashed potatoes, a table of my own. Dad cleared his throat loudly. The sound was aggressive, a demand for normalcy to return. His face had gone a shade darker, a blotchy red creeping up his neck. He knew, somewhere, deep down in that lizard brain of his, he knew I had just drawn a line in the sand, even if he did not understand the geography of it yet.
"Right,"
Dad said, his voice tight.
"Well, to family."
"To family," the table mumbled back, but the enthusiasm was gone. The toast fell flat, landing like a dead bird in the center of the spread. Dad sat down heavily. He stabbed a slice of turkey with unnecessary force. "Pass the gravy," he barked at Mom. Mom scrambled to obey, her hands shaking slightly as she lifted the boat. She glanced at me, a fleeting look of terror and confusion, before turning her attention back to soothing the beast at the head of the table. I did not eat. I could not have swallowed a bite if my life depended on it. Instead, I sat back. I watched them. It was a strange sensation, like the prescription on a pair of glasses had suddenly been corrected. I saw the way Brandon chewed with his mouth open, arrogant and assured. I saw the way Aunt Beatrice whispered to her husband, their eyes darting toward me. I saw the way Dad ate, tearing at the meat, still simmering with the indignation of having his moment disrupted. I realized then that this was it. This was the last time. I moved my hand slowly to my lap. My phone was resting there on the napkin. I had developed a habit years ago, a defense mechanism born of gaslighting. I never said that. "Talia, you are imagining things. Talia, you are too sensitive. Talia." So, I had started recording, just for me, just so I knew I was not crazy. I tapped the screen. The red waveform on the voice memo app was still pulsing, capturing the scrape of forks and the tense silence. It had caught the toast. It had caught the laughter. It had caught the slur. And it had caught my response. I saved the file. I named it Thanksgiving. Then, I picked up my linen napkin. I folded it, corner to corner, neat, precise. I placed it next to my untouched plate. "Thank you for the dinner, Mom," I whispered. The sound of my chair scraping against the hardwood floor was loud, screeching like a warning siren. Dad looked up, a forkful of stuffing halfway to his mouth. "Where are you going?" he demanded. "We have not even had pie." "I am full," I said. I stood up. I felt tall. For the first time in that house, I felt like I was occupying exactly the amount of space I was supposed to. I turned my back on the table. I walked toward the archway that led to the hall. I could feel their eyes boring into my back, a collective laser of judgment and confusion. I knew what they would say as soon as I was out of earshot. They would say I was dramatic. They would say I ruined the mood. They would say I was difficult. Let them talk. I walked past the living room, past the wall of fame where Brandon's high school football photos were collecting dust, past the empty space where my diploma should have been. I walked to the front closet and grabbed my coat. My heart was still hammering, but my hands were steady. I opened the front door and stepped out into the biting Ohio November air. It was cold, freezing actually, but after the stifling heat of that dining room, it felt like freedom. I had left my plate full, but I had what I needed in my pocket. I had the recording, and more importantly, I had the realization that the table inside that house was not the only table in the world. I walked to my rental car, unlocked the door, and got in. I did not look back at the house with its glowing yellow windows and its perfect white fence. I started the engine, put the car in drive, and began the journey back to the place where I did not just take up space, the place where I designed it. The architecture of my childhood in Maple Grove was built on a very specific type of physics. Brandon was the sun, massive and blinding, and the rest of us were just cold planets orbiting in his gravity. Our house was a two-story colonial with a white fence that looked perfect from the street. The kind of house that real estate agents put on brochures to sell the American dream. But inside, the walls told a different story. If you walked down the main hallway, you were forced to navigate a museum dedicated to the glory of Brandon Monroe. To the left, a framed jersey from his sophomore year, preserved behind glass like a religious relic. To the right, shelves groaning under the weight of gold-painted plastic trophies. Most valuable player, regional champion, all-state quarterback. There were action shots of him mid-throw. His face contorted in a scream of athletic exertion, blown up to poster size. The hallway was a tunnel of his triumphs, ensuring that even when he was asleep, his presence was the loudest thing in the house. My achievements, on the other hand, were considered administrative clutter. I remember coming home in 7th grade with a certificate for first place in the district science fair. I had built a water filtration system using charcoal and sand layers that I had researched for weeks. I stood in the kitchen, holding the heavy cardstock with its gold foil seal, waiting for Dad to hang up the phone. When he finally did, he glanced at the paper, gave me a distracted pat on the shoulder, and said, "That is nice, honey. Put it in the drawer so it does not get crinkled." The drawer. It was the bottom one under the staircase, the one that stuck if you pulled it too hard. That was where my life went. My report cards with straight A's, my art projects, my coding certificates. They were all shoved in there with the dead batteries, the rubber bands, and the takeout menus. Dad called it keeping things tidy, but even at 12 years old, I understood the subtext. Displaying my success would take up wall space reserved for Brandon. My wins were private accidents. His wins were public necessities. The dinner table was where this hierarchy was enforced with ritualistic precision. We had assigned seats, of course, but we also had assigned roles. Dad was the interviewer, Mom was the audience, Brandon was the star, and I was the stagehand. Every night at 6 o'clock, the interrogation began. Dad would lean forward, his fork suspended, and ask, "How was practice, son?" And for the next 20 minutes, we would listen to a play-by-play of a high school football practice. Brandon would talk about the coaches yelling, the way the turf felt, the pass he almost caught. Dad would nod, dissecting the strategy, offering advice on grip and stance. Mom would chime in with supportive noises, pouring more iced tea whenever a glass looked half empty. I sat there, cutting my meat into tiny, precise squares, rendering myself invisible. If I tried to speak, if I tried to mention that I had learned a new programming language or that I was reading a book about astrophysics, Dad would offer a tight, indulgent smile. "Talia," he would say, his voice dropping to that half-joking, half-warning tone. "Girls do not need to be so loud. Boys need to make a mark. You just need to be pleasant." Pleasant. That was the word that haunted me. Pleasant meant quiet. Pleasant meant taking up zero emotional bandwidth. Pleasant meant shrinking until you fit into the cracks in the floorboards. Mom was the enforcer of this silence, though she did it out of fear, not malice. She operated on a policy of appeasement. "Do not make your father angry," she would whisper to me when I complained that Brandon had taken over the living room TV for his video games again. "Just go read in your room. Be the bigger person." Being the bigger person in the Monroe house always meant making myself smaller. It meant giving up my room when Brandon's teammates crashed over for the weekend, sleeping on the couch while they laughed and shouted upstairs. It meant that when the budget was tight, my request for a $300 robotics camp was denied because Brandon needed new cleats that cost exactly that much. "It is an investment in his future," Dad had explained, not looking at me. "Scouts look at the gear. Talia, nobody is scouting for whatever it is you do." So I found a place where I did not have to be pleasant, and I did not have to be the bigger person. I found the garage. It was a detached structure behind the house, drafty and smelling of motor oil and sawdust. It was filled with Dad's abandoned projects, a lawnmower he swore he would fix, rusted tools, boxes of holiday decorations. To everyone else, it was a storage unit. To me, It was a laboratory. I started scavenging. On trash days, I would ride my bike through the neighborhood, looking for electronics that people had thrown away, a toaster with a broken lever, a VCR that chewed tapes, a printer that refused to print. I dragged them back to the garage, hiding them behind stacks of old tires. There, under the harsh light of a single naked bulb, I took them apart. I loved the inside of machines. There was no ego there, no favorites. A circuit board did not care if you were a boy or a girl. A capacitor did not care if you played football. If you connected the wires correctly, the current flowed. If you wrote the code right, the light blinked. It was a world of pure, brutal logic, and it was the only place I felt safe. I built a workbench out of 2 sawhorses and an old door I found in a skip. That was my first table. It was rough, splintered, and uneven, but it was mine. I spent hours there, ignoring the cold Ohio winters, my breath puffing in the air as I soldered connections on a motherboard I was trying to salvage. The only person who ever crossed the threshold into my world was Grandma Rosemary. She lived 4 blocks away, a small, fierce woman who smelled of lavender and old paper. She would appear at the garage door on Saturday afternoons, usually carrying a slice of pie wrapped in foil. She never asked why I was not inside playing with dolls or watching TV. She would just pull up an overturned milk crate and watch me work. One afternoon, I was struggling to reassemble a motor from an old blender I wanted to turn into a centrifuge. I was frustrated. Grease smeared across my cheek, close to tears. "Dad says I am wasting my time," I muttered, not looking up. "He says I am just making a mess in his garage." Grandma Rosemary leaned forward, her eyes sharp behind her glasses. "Your father," she said, her voice low and scratchy, "thinks the only way to build something is to make noise about it. He does not understand that the most powerful things in the world work silently." She reached out and tapped the motor I was holding. "You are not making a mess, Talia, and you are not taking up space. You are creating a new space, a space that did not exist before you made it. Do not ever let them convince you that your creation is less real just because it does not have a scoreboard." I held on to those words like a lifeline. I repeated them to myself when I was soldering at 2 a.m, creating a new space. But even lifelines can fray. The breaking point came when I was 16. I had entered a regional robotics competition. It was a big deal. The winner got a fast-track interview for a scholarship and a cash prize. I had spent 6 months building an autonomous rover designed to navigate rubble. I named it the Badger. It was ugly, boxy, and relentless, just like me. I had put the date of the competition on the family calendar in the kitchen 3 months in advance. I had circled it in red marker. I had reminded Mom and Dad every week. "It is the finals," I told them. "I am in the top 5. I have a real chance." "We will be there," Mom had promised, looking anxious. "We will try." The day of the competition, the gymnasium was packed. There were banners, cheering sections, parents holding up signs with their kids' names. I stood by my display table, wearing my oversized team t-shirt, my hands sweating. The Badger was ready. I was ready. I scanned the bleachers. I looked for Dad's gray windbreaker. I looked for Mom's nervous smile. I saw parents hugging their kids. I saw flashes of cameras. I saw a sea of strangers. They were not there. I checked my phone. Nothing. I checked again 5 minutes later. Nothing. When the judges came to my station, I forced a smile. I ran the demo. The Badger performed perfectly, climbing over the obstacle course, locating the heat signature, and retrieving the target. The judges nodded, impressed. One of them, a professor from the state university, shook my hand. "Incredible engineering," he said. "Who helped you with the logic gates?" "I did it myself," I said. "Your parents must be proud," he smiled, gesturing to the empty space behind me. I swallowed the lump in my throat that felt like broken glass. "They are on their way." I took second place, a silver medal and a certificate. When I got home, the house was quiet. Brandon's gear bag was in the hallway, exploding with dirty laundry. I found Mom in the kitchen, heating up leftovers. "You missed it," I said. "It wasn't a question. Mom winced, not turning around. "Oh, honey, I am so sorry. Brandon's coach called a last-minute practice, a scrimmage. Dad thought it was important to be there to show support for the new plays." "A practice?" I asked, my voice trembling. "You missed the finals for a practice?" "Your father said." She trailed off, finally turning to look at me, her eyes pleading. "He said you would understand. Robotics it is not like sports. Talia, it is not a spectator event. He did not think you would notice if we were not there." I looked at her, and then I looked at the silver medal in my hand. It felt heavy and cold. "I noticed," I whispered. I did not yell. I did not throw the medal. I walked past her, down the hallway, past the shrine of trophies, and out the back door. I went to the garage. It was freezing, the concrete floor radiating a bone-deep chill. I did not turn on the heater. I wanted the cold. I sat down at my makeshift table, the old door on the sawhorses. I had a slice of cold pizza left over from my lunch in my backpack. I took it out and took a bite. The cheese was rubbery, the crust stale. I set the silver medal on the table next to a pile of stripped copper wire. In the dim light, it didn't look like a prize. It looked like scrap metal. I opened my laptop. The screen glowed blue, illuminating my hands. I brought up the code for the badger. I started typing, optimizing the pathfinding algorithm, making it faster, smarter, more independent. As I typed, the tears finally came. They ran down my face silently, dripping onto the keyboard, but I did not stop working. I let the anger burn through me, fueling the logic, sharpening the code. That night, alone in the garage with the smell of old oil and the hum of my hard drive, I made a vow. It wasn't a wish. It was a contract with myself. They will never see me, I thought, my fingers flying across the keys. So I will stop trying to be seen. I will build something so big, so undeniable, that they can't look away. And I will do it at my own table, in my own house, where no one cares about touchdowns. I looked at the folding table, wobbly and scarred with burn marks from my soldering iron. "One day," I said aloud to the empty garage, "one day, I will be the one who decides who sits and who stands." I bit into the cold pizza again, staring at the cursor blinking on the screen. It was a rhythmic pulse. Blink, 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 like a heartbeat. My heartbeat. Strong, steady, and entirely my own. The acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday in April. It was thick, creamy, and carried the seal of a university near San Meridian, California. I held it in my hands by the mailbox, feeling the weight of the paper stock. It weighed less than an ounce, but it felt like I was holding an anchor that had finally been cut loose from the seabed. Experience design and product engineering. Full scholarship. 3,000 miles. I walked into the kitchen where my father was drinking his coffee, staring at the sports section of the local paper. I placed the envelope on the table, not near his elbow, but squarely in the center of his placemat. He glanced at it, read the return address, and let out a short, dismissive breath through his nose. He did not open it. He did not ask what was inside. He simply pushed it back toward me with the tip of his finger, as if it were a piece of junk mail that had been delivered to the wrong house. "California," he said, the word tasting like vinegar in his mouth. "That is a long way to go to learn how to draw furniture, Talia." "It is a full scholarship, Dad," I said, my voice steady, "and it is not just drawing furniture, it is engineering human interaction." He turned the page of his newspaper. "Well, if you go that far, you are on your own. Do not expect me to pay for flights back and forth every time you get homesick, and do not expect me to co-sign any loans for an apartment. If you leave this house to go play artist, you leave on your own dime." That was the moment the last tether snapped. I had been waiting, perhaps subconsciously, for one final reason to stay. A "please do not go," or even a "we will miss you." Instead, I got a financial ultimatum. I spent the next 4 months working 3 jobs. I steamed milk at a coffee shop from 5 in the morning until noon. I filed paperwork at a dental office in the afternoons. I tutored high school students in math until 9 at night. My life became a blur of caffeine, paper cuts, and the smell of antiseptic. Every paycheck was cashed and deposited into a separate account that Greg Monroe had no access to. I saved $2,400. It was enough for a one-way ticket, a security deposit on a shared room in a house with 5 other students, and exactly 3 weeks of ramen noodles. When I packed, I did not take much. My clothes were mostly hand-me-downs or thrift store finds anyway, but at the bottom of my suitcase, wrapped carefully in plastic sleeves, were my drawings. They were sketches I had done in the garage late at night. Tables, not the heavy, rectangular monstrosities that dominated the dining rooms of Maple Grove, but circles, ovals, flowing shapes, tables where no one sat at the head because there was no head. I left on a gray morning in August. Mom cried in the driveway, pressing a $20 bill into my hand like it was contraband. Dad was at work. He had not taken the day off. Landing in San Meridian was like stepping onto a different planet. The air smelled of salt and jasmine, not damp leaves and floor wax. The light was different here, gold and relentless, exposing everything. But what shocked me most wasn't the weather. It was the furniture. My first day, I walked into a coffee shop near campus. It was a massive industrial space with concrete floors and exposed beams. In the center of the room was a single, enormous table made of reclaimed redwood. It must have been 20 feet long. I froze in the doorway. People were sitting there. Strangers. A guy in a suit typing on a laptop sat next to a student with purple hair reading a comic book. A mother feeding a baby sat across from an elderly man sketching in a notebook. There were no assigned seats. There was no hierarchy. No one was at the head. They were just people, sharing a surface, existing in the same plane. I bought a black coffee and sat at the edge of that table. I waited for someone to tell me to move. I waited for the feeling of being in the way. It never came. The guy in the suit nodded at me and moved his latte to give me more room. I almost cried right there in front of my Americano. For 4 years, I threw myself into the theory of space. I became obsessed with the psychology of architecture. Why do we build walls? Why do we elevate certain chairs? How does the shape of a room dictate who holds the power within it? My professors loved me. They called my work provocative and deeply empathetic. They had no idea that my empathy was born of trauma. I designed communal dining halls for shelters. I created modular seating for libraries that forced eye contact rather than avoidance. My thesis project was titled, The Architecture of Inclusion, Removing the Invisible Barriers in Domestic Spaces. I graduated top of my class. Dad did not come to the ceremony. Mom sent a card signed by both of them, but the handwriting was entirely hers. 2 weeks after graduation, I was hired by Lumen Nest Lab for Human Spaces. Lumen Nest was not a furniture company. It was a think tank that built environments. It was run by a woman named Juliana, an architect who believed that a room could heal a broken nervous system if you built it right. The studio was a converted warehouse near the docks, filled with light and the smell of sawdust and beeswax. "I like your portfolio," Talia, Juliana had said during my interview, tapping a sketch of a circular dining table with a rotating center. "You design as if you are afraid someone is going to be left out. It is very specific." "I just think everyone should be able to reach the salt," I had replied. At Lumen Nest, I was finally allowed to build the things that had lived in my head since I was 12. I worked on a project for a community center where we designed a table that undulated like a river, allowing small groups to form within a larger gathering without breaking the flow. We designed lighting fixtures that cast a soft, diffuse glow, ensuring that no face was left in shadow, no matter where they sat. I became the lead engineer on the Hearth Project, a line of furniture designed for foster homes and group living facilities. The goal was to create stability through design, heavy, grounded tables that could not be tipped over, chairs that felt like hugs. One afternoon, we were presenting a custom dining set to a wealthy couple who wanted to overhaul their vacation home to host retreats for at-risk youth. The husband, a kind man with kind eyes, ran his hand over the smooth grain of the American black walnut table I had designed. "This is remarkable," he said softly. "The way the grain flows toward the center. It pulls you in. It makes you want to listen." He looked up at me, smiling. "You have a gift for creating intimacy. Talia, you must have grown up in a very warm, tight-knit family to understand how to bring people together like this." The air in the room seemed to freeze for a second. I felt the phantom sensation of my father's spoon tapping against the wineglass. Cling, cling. I forced a smile. It was the professional smile I had perfected over 4 years of client meetings. "Thank you," I said. I certainly learned a lot about the importance of a dinner table from my family. It was not a lie. It was just a truth they would never understand. I learned that a table could be a weapon. I learned that a chair could be a throne. I learned that silence could be louder than shouting. I built these tables not to replicate my childhood, but to exercise it. That night, after the clients had left and the rest of the team had gone home, I stayed in the studio. The warehouse was quiet, save for the hum of the ventilation system and the distant sound of foghorns from the harbor. I walked over to the prototype area. In the center of the room stood my latest creation. It was a dining table, but it was unlike anything in a catalog. It was an oval, but slightly asymmetrical, wider at one end to accommodate wheelchairs or high chairs, without breaking the visual line. The legs were inset deep beneath the surface so no one would ever bang their knee or have to straddle a table leg. The wood was pale ash, warm and soft to the touch. I ran my hand along the edge. It was beveled, smooth as silk. I thought about the table in Maple Grove, the sharp corners, the dark, imposing mahogany, the way the head of the table loomed over the rest of us. I walked around my new table. I walked to the spot that would traditionally be the head. I stood there. Then I walked to the side. Then to the other end. Every seat offered the same view. Every seat had the same amount of space. Every seat was valid. I pulled out a chair. It was one I had designed myself, with a back that flexed slightly to support the spine, signaling to the sitter, "You can relax. You are safe here." I sat down. The studio was dark, illuminated only by the streetlights filtering through the high windows. I placed my hands flat on the surface of the table. I felt the solid wood beneath my palms. It felt grounded. It felt real. For the first time in my life, I was sitting at a table where I did not feel the urge to check my phone, or shrink my shoulders, or calculate how quickly I could finish eating and leave. I did not feel like a planet orbiting a sun. I felt like I was the center of my own gravity. I closed my eyes and breathed in the smell of the workshop, varnish, wood, and the salty Pacific air. "This is it," I whispered into the silence. I opened my eyes and looked at the empty chairs surrounding me. They were not empty because I was excluded. They were empty because I had not invited anyone yet. And that was the difference. The choice was mine. "This is the first table," I said, my voice stronger now, "that I do not have to ask permission to sit at." I sat there for a long time, watching the dust motes dance in the light of the street lamps, feeling the distance between myself and Ohio stretching out like a physical thing. 3,000 miles. It was a long way to run. But looking at the smooth, pale wood in front of me, I knew it was exactly far enough. I had built a new world, one plank at a time, and I was finally ready to inhabit it. The first crack in the foundation of my new life appeared in the form of a Thanksgiving card. It arrived 3 weeks before the holiday, tucked between a utility bill and a flyer for a local pizza place in San Meridian. The envelope was standard white, cheap, the kind you buy in bulk at a pharmacy, but the handwriting on the front made my pulse stutter. It was my grandmother Rosemary's script, but it was wrong. The loops of the T in Talia were jagged, and the slant of the letters veered sharply downward, as if her hand had been fighting gravity and losing. I opened it standing in the middle of my kitchen, the California sun streaming in through the window, illuminating the dust motes. Inside, the pre-printed greeting wished me a harvest of blessings. Beneath it, in blue ballpoint pen, Rosemary had written a single, shaky paragraph. "My dear Talia, The days are getting shorter. I miss your face. I hope you can come home this year. There are things I need to tell you. Things about the house. Things about the accounts. Please come before it is too late. Love, Grandma. Before it is too late. I stared at the words. Grandma Rosemary was 82, but she had always been as sturdy as an oak tree. She was the woman who still mowed her own lawn, the woman who had taught me that silence could be a form of rebellion. This sounded like a woman who was frightened. I reached for my phone to call her, but before I could dial, a notification banner slid down from the top of my screen. It was an email alert from a bank I had not banked with in 6 years. Subject: Alert. Large cash withdrawal on ending in 492. I frowned. Account 492. It took me a moment to dig through the sediment of my memory. When I was 18, just before I left for college, Grandma Rosemary had added me as a secondary contact on her primary checking account. She had done it in secret, driving me to the bank branch 2 towns over. Just in case, Talia, she had said, if anything happens to me, or if I get locked out, I want someone smart to have the keys. I had forgotten about it. I had never touched the money. I assumed she had removed me years ago when Dad took over managing her affairs. I opened the email. Transaction date: November 2nd. Amount: $5,000. Type: counter withdrawal. $5,000, cash. My stomach tightened. Grandma Rosemary lived on a fixed pension and Social Security. She was frugal. She bought day-old bread and mended her own coats. She did not walk into a bank and take out $5,000 in cash. I scrolled down. There were more alerts that had been filtered into my spam folder over the last 3 months, which I had missed. October 15th, withdrawal, $2,500. September 30th, withdrawal, $3,000. Over $10,000 in 8 weeks. I dialed her number immediately. It rang 4 times, 5 times. I was about to hang up when the line clicked open. Hello? The voice was faint, brittle. It sounded like her, but thinner. Grandma? It is Talia. Talia? Her voice hitched. Oh, thank goodness. I did not think you would call. I got your card, Grandma. And I got an email from the bank, the joint account. What is going on? Why are you taking out so much cash? There was a pause on the line. I heard a rustling sound, like a hand covering the receiver, and then the muffled sound of a door closing. I am not taking it out, Talia, she whispered, her voice trembling. I do not know where it is going. The statements, they disappear. Greg says he is handling it. He says it is for maintenance, for taxes. $10,000 in taxes? I asked, my grip on the phone tightening until my knuckles turned white. Grandma, that does not make sense. Let me speak to Dad. No! The panic in her voice was sharp, immediate. He is not here right now. He is at the club. Listen to me. Talia, I feel confused lately. Sometimes I sign things and I do not remember them, but I know I did not spend that money. You have to come. If you can come, please. I will be there, I said. I will book a flight tonight. Good, she breathed. Good. Just do not tell him we spoke about the money. He gets so angry when I ask questions. He says I'm losing my mind. The line went dead before I could say goodbye. I stood there, the silence of my apartment suddenly feeling heavy and oppressive. My father, Greg Monroe, the man who demanded to sit at the head of the table, was managing her finances, and he was telling her she was crazy while her savings drained away like water from a cracked bucket. 2 hours later, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text message. The name on the screen made my jaw clench. Dad. I opened it. It was characteristic of Greg Monroe. No greeting, no warmth, just a command disguised as information. Thanksgiving this year. Come home for the sake of appearance. Grandma is failing. She is weak. Do not make this difficult. He did not ask how I was. He did not say he wanted to see me. He used his own mother's health as a bargaining chip to ensure the family portrait looked complete. Grandma is failing. The phrasing made my skin crawl. It sounded less like a medical observation and more like a narrative he was constructing. I went to work the next day with a knot of anxiety in my chest that no amount of coffee could dissolve. At Luminest, we were in the middle of a design sprint for a new civic project. Juliana, my boss, was projecting a rendering onto the main wall. It was a community center for senior citizens in Oregon. "The concept here is dignity," Juliana was saying, pointing to the central atrium. "We are designing an intake area for legal and financial counseling. Look at the furniture." I looked. The rendering showed a long, wide table made of light oak. On one side sat a senior citizen, on the other, a counselor. But the table was designed with a slight curve, bringing them closer together, and the chairs were at equal heights. The lighting was warm, focused on the papers between them. "We want to avoid the interrogation dynamic," Juliana explained. "Too often, seniors are placed in low chairs across from high desks. It makes them feel small. It makes them feel like they are being processed rather than helped. We want a table that says, 'You are still in charge of your life.'" I stared at the screen. I saw Grandma Rosemary sitting at a very different kind of table. I saw her at the dark mahogany dining table in Maple Grove, sitting in a chair that was too big for her, squinting at papers she could not read, while my father towered over her, tapping his pen, telling her where to sign. I felt a surge of nausea. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the space. It was about the architecture of control. My father was dismantling her autonomy, brick by brick, dollar by dollar, using the very trust she had placed in him as a weapon. I stood up. "Talia?" Juliana asked, pausing her presentation. "Everything okay?" "I have to go home," I said. My voice was surprisingly steady. "I have to go to Ohio." "Is everything all right?" "No," I said, "but I am going to fix it." I spent the next 48 hours in a frenzy of preparation. This was not a holiday visit. This was a reconnaissance mission. I went to an electronics store and bought a high-capacity external hard drive. I logged into the bank portal using the credentials I had set up 10 years ago. Miraculously, they still worked, though the password was BadgerBot 2012. I downloaded everything: PDF statements going back 5 years, transaction logs, canceled check images. I saw checks signed with a scrawl that looked like Rosemary's name written by someone trying to imitate a tremor. I saw transfers to an LLC I did not recognize, Monroe Consulting Group. I saved it all. I encrypted the drive. I made a backup to a secure cloud server. Then I packed. I did not pack for a celebration. I packed tailored blazers that made me look like the professional I was. I packed my voice recorder. I packed the hard drive in my carry-on, wrapped in a sweater. I boarded the red-eye flight to Cleveland on Wednesday night. The plane was packed with people going home for turkey and pumpkin pie. The mood was festive. I sat by the window, staring out at the black void of the sky. I drifted into a restless sleep somewhere over the Rockies. In my dream, I was back in the dining room in Maple Grove. The room was dark, lit only by a single flickering candle in the center of the table. Grandma Rosemary was sitting there, but she was tiny, the size of a doll. The table was covered in mountains of paper, legal documents, bank statements, deeds. The papers were piling up around her, burying her. She was trying to push them away, but her hands were made of porcelain and they kept cracking. At the head of the table, the chair was empty, but it wasn't just empty. It was vibrating with a dark, heavy energy. I could hear my father's voice coming from the empty chair, booming and distorted. "Just sign it. Mom, you are taking up space. You are just taking up space." I tried to run to her, but my feet were stuck in the floorboards. I tried to scream. "I built a new table!" But no sound came out. The papers rose higher and higher, covering Rosemary's face until she disappeared completely. And all that was left was the empty chair at the head of the table, laughing. I woke up with a gasp as the landing gear deployed with a heavy thud. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Cleveland." The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Current ground temperature is 28 degrees with light snow." I walked off the plane and into the terminal. The air in the jet bridge was freezing, carrying that distinct Midwestern scent of winter, cold asphalt and damp wool. It hit my lungs like a shock, waking up every nerve in my body. I pulled my coat tighter around me. I walked past the happy families reuniting at the baggage claim, past the fathers hugging their daughters, past the mothers crying tears of joy. I walked out to the rental car center. I did not call my parents to pick me up. I did not want to be a passenger in their car. I needed to be the driver. I threw my bag into the passenger seat of a nondescript silver sedan. I sat behind the wheel and looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked tired. There were dark circles under my eyes, but beneath the exhaustion, there was something else, a hardness that hadn't been there 4 years ago. I reached into my bag and touched the cold metal casing of the hard drive. "I am coming, Grandma," I whispered to the empty car. I put the car in gear and drove out into the gray morning. I was heading back to the house where I had been invisible, back to the table where I had been a ghost. But this time, I wasn't looking for a seat. I was looking for the truth, and I wasn't coming back with empty hands. The gravel crunching under the tires of my rental car in Grandma Rosemary's driveway sounded like thunder in the quiet afternoon. I killed the engine and sat for a moment, staring at her porch. The flower pots were empty, overturned against the winter wind. It was a small detail, but for a woman who used to force bulbs into the frozen earth every November so they would bloom by March, it was a screaming alarm bell. I knocked, and it took a long time for her to answer. When the door finally opened, I had to suppress a gasp. She looked smaller, not just physically frail, but diminished, as if someone had turned down the dimmer switch on her soul.
"Talia," she breathed, her eyes widening behind her bifocals. "You came." "I told you I would, Grandma."
Inside, the house smelled of stale tea and old paper. It was tidy in the way that uninhabited rooms are tidy, dust-free but lifeless. However, the dining table, usually bare except for a lace runner, was a disaster zone. It was covered in stacks of paper, white envelopes, yellow window envelopes, manila folders. "I was just trying to sort through things," she said. Following my gaze, she plucked at the sleeve of her cardigan nervously. "But my eyes aren't what they used to be, and the numbers, they seem to jump around on the page." I walked over to the table. I saw a red stamp on one envelope. "Past due." I saw a logo for a credit card company I knew she never used. "Grandma," I said, picking up a statement from the electric company. It was unopened. "This is 3 months old. Why haven't you paid this?" She looked away, her hands fluttering like trapped birds. "Greg said he would handle it. He said I shouldn't worry my pretty little head about the bills anymore. He said he set up, autopay." "Autopay doesn't leave past due notices on your table," I said gently. "He says I forget things," she whispered, leaning against the doorframe. "He says I paid them, but I forgot, and the company's made mistakes. He says I'm getting confused. Talia, maybe I am." "You are not confused, Grandma. You are tired." I guided her to the armchair in the living room. "Why don't you go make us some tea? The peppermint kind I like. I will just tidy up this pile for you so you don't have to look at the mess." "That would be nice," she said, looking relieved to be given a task she understood. "Peppermint, I think I have some." As soon as she shuffled into the kitchen and I heard the kettle running water, I moved. I did not tidy, I investigated. I pulled my phone from my pocket and switched to the camera mode. I worked fast, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I flipped open the folder marked Greg, Legal. First photo, a durable power of attorney document. It was dated 4 months ago. The signature at the bottom was Rosemary's, but it was shaky, trailing off at the end. The witness signature was Greg's golf buddy, a notary named Pete. Second photo, a bank transfer request, moving funds from her primary savings, the one she had built up over 50 years of teaching piano, into an account under the name Monroe Consulting Group, LLC. The amount was $15,000. Third photo, a credit card application in her name, but the billing address was a P.O. box in downtown Maple Grove that I knew my father used for his business mail. My hands were shaking, but the camera lens was steady. I snapped picture after picture, statements showing cash withdrawals at casinos in Columbus, receipts for home repairs from a contractor that didn't exist, billed to her account. I found a letter from her investment broker, questioning a liquidation of assets. Across the top, in my father's distinct, jagged handwriting, was a note. Ignore, already handled. He was not just managing her money, he was harvesting it. He was stripping her dry while she was still alive, convincing her that her memory was the problem, not his greed. He was gaslighting his own mother into poverty so he could maintain the illusion of his successful lifestyle. The whistle of the tea kettle shrieked from the kitchen. I jumped, shoving the papers back into a semblance of order. I shoved the power of attorney document back into the folder. I took a deep breath, smoothing my hair, forcing my face into a mask of calm. When Grandma came back with the tray, I was sitting on the sofa, scrolling through my phone innocently. "Here we are," she said, setting the tray down. I stood up and hugged her. I held her tighter than I ever had, feeling the fragile bones of her back through her sweater. I wanted to tell her right then. I wanted to scream that her son was a thief, but I knew I couldn't. Not yet. I needed to verify the Monroe Consulting Group registration. I needed to map out the entire trail before I dropped the hammer. If I spoke too soon, Greg would spin it. He would claim she was senile, that I was meddling, that I was the one trying to take advantage.
"I love you, Grandma," I said into her shoulder.
"I love you too, sweetie." She patted my cheek. "You smell like California. You smell like sunshine." I left 10 minutes later. I had the evidence in my pocket, burning a hole through my coat. The drive to my parents' house was a blur. I was operating on cold, hard adrenaline. I pulled up to the familiar 2-story house. The windows were glowing yellow. I could see the silhouette of the Christmas tree already up in the living room. It looked idyllic. It looked like a lie. I checked my pocket. Phone, voice recorder app, photos. I walked in. The heat hit me first, then the noise. Brandon was in the hallway, wrestling with his 2 sons. His wife was laughing. Mom was rushing from the kitchen with a platter of deviled eggs.
"Talia," Mom cried, looking flustered. "You made it. You are late. Dad is already pouring the wine."
"Hello, Mom," I said. I did not take off my coat immediately. I felt like I needed the armor. I walked into the dining room. There it was, the table. It was set exactly as it had been every year of my life. The good china, the heavy silver forks, and Greg Monroe at the head, holding a bottle of Cabernet, looking like a king holding court. "Well," he said, not standing up to greet me, "the prodigal daughter returns. We were about to start without you." "Traffic," I lied. I took my seat, the corner seat, the space between the children and the wall. I sat down, and my hand slid into my pocket. I felt the phone. I unlocked it blindly with my thumb and swiped to the voice recorder. I hit the red button. I wasn't recording this time to preserve my sanity. I was recording to build a case. If he was willing to defraud his mother, what else was he lying about? I needed his voice. I needed his character on tape. I needed the jury, whether it was a legal one or just the family, to hear exactly who Greg Monroe was. The dinner began. The noise level rose. Brandon dominated the conversation, talking about his new truck, about how much it cost, about the horsepower. 70,000, Brandon boasted, chewing with his mouth open. "But you gotta pay for quality, right, Dad?" "Absolutely," Greg nodded, his eyes shining. "You get what you pay for in this world. Son, cheap things break, quality lasts." I looked at Greg. I wondered if the $15,000 he stole from Grandma Rosemary went into that truck. I wondered if the quality he admired was funded by the confusion of an 80-year-old woman. I took a sip of water. It tasted like iron. Then came the tapping. Cling, cling. The room went silent. The ritual began. Greg stood up. He did the vest smooth. He did the throat clear. "Another year," he began. The speech was almost identical to the one I remembered from 4 years ago, and likely the one he gave last year. It was a script. I look around this table. I watched him. I watched the way he preened. I watched the way he looked at Brandon with that hungry, desperate pride. And then I saw his eyes slide toward me. It was coming. You know, Greg said, a smirk playing on his lips, emboldened by the wine and the audience. I was thinking about value today, about what we bring to the table. He chuckled. Some of us bring the turkey. Some of us bring the wine. Brandon, you bring the legacy. Brandon beamed. And some people, Greg's eyes locked on mine, cold and dead. Some people just take up space. The table erupted. Brandon laughed the loudest, a harsh barking sound. Mom giggled nervously, her eyes darting to her plate. I felt the familiar punch to the gut, the old reflex of shame trying to curl my shoulders inward. But then I felt the weight of the phone in my pocket. I thought of the photos of the forged signatures. I thought of the empty flower pots on Grandma's porch. The shame evaporated. It was replaced by a clarity so sharp it felt like I had swallowed a diamond. He thought I was weak. He thought I was just a body occupying a chair he paid for. He had no idea that I was currently holding the detonator that could blow his carefully constructed kingdom to pieces. I did not look down. I did not cry. I looked straight at him. I looked at the man who stole from his mother and mocked his daughter. That is funny, Dad, I said. My voice was calm, cutting through the laughter like a scalpel. The room quieted. Because, I continued, it is lucky that I just built a table of my own 3,000 miles away. The silence was instant. It was heavy. What table? A cousin asked, confusing the moment. Just a table, I said, smiling a smile that had no warmth in it. Greg glared at me, his jaw working. He didn't like that I hadn't crumbled. He didn't like that I wasn't playing my part in his play. Well, he grunted. Good for you. Hope it is sturdy. It is, I said. It is very sturdy. It stands on its own. It does not need to lean on anyone else's money to stay upright. Greg's eyes narrowed. He heard the subtext. I saw a flicker of genuine fear behind his bluster. He wondered, just for a second, what I knew. I didn't wait for the pie. I didn't wait for the coffee. I reached into my pocket and stopped the recording. Save. I picked up my napkin and placed it on the table. Thank you for the meal, Mom, I said. I stood up. Sit down, Talia, Greg barked. We are not done. I am, I said. I walked out of the dining room. I could feel their eyes on my back, but this time, it didn't feel like judgment. It felt like I was leaving a crime scene. I walked to the front door, grabbed my coat, and stepped out into the biting cold of the Ohio night. I patted my pocket. I had the voice of the abuser on tape. I had the paper trail of the thief in my phone. I wasn't just the daughter who took up space anymore. I was the witness. And as I walked to my car, the cold air filling my lungs, I knew that the next time I sat at a table with Greg Monroe, he wouldn't be sitting at the head. He would be sitting wherever I told him to. Flying back to California felt different this time. On the way to Ohio, I had been a detective, tight with anxiety and adrenaline. On the way back, I felt lighter. The evidence was safe in my carry-on. The hard drive, the recordings, the photos of the forged signatures, but the heaviness of the secret was counterbalanced by a strange new clarity. I was done auditing my worth at Greg Monroe's table. I had the data I needed to protect Grandma Rosemary, and that meant I no longer needed to play the role of the dutiful, invisible daughter hoping for scraps of validation. I landed in San Meridian, to a sky that was an impossible shade of blue. The air was crisp, smelling of eucalyptus and the ocean, a sharp contrast to the damp, gray wool of the Midwest. I went straight to the studio. Juliana was there, looking over the blueprints for the new community center project we had discussed before I left. You are back, she said, looking up from the drafting table. You look resolved. I am, I said. I walked over to the blueprints. This table, the one for the center. We need to change the materials. No pine. It is too soft. It dents too easily. We need walnut, American black walnut, and steel legs. It needs to look like it can take a hit and not shake.
Juliana smiled. That will blow the budget.
I will find the money, I said, or I will build it myself. And I did. Over the next 3 weeks, leading up to Christmas, I poured myself into the prototype. I stayed late in the workshop, planning the wood, smelling the rich, dark dust of the walnut. I welded the base myself, sparks flying in the dark studio, fusing the steel into a structure that was immovable. I decided that this table, the first of its kind, the sanctuary table as I called it in the design docs, needed a proper christening. Not a ribbon-cutting ceremony with donors and champagne, but a meal, a real meal. I hauled the table into my apartment 3 days before Christmas. It took 4 guys to move it up the stairs, but when it was settled in the center of my living room, it anchored the space. It was beautiful. The wood had a depth to it, a swirling grain that looked like a topographical map of a safe harbor. I sent out the invites. I did not invite people based on status or bloodline. I invited the people who had been my scaffolding when I was building this life from scratch. There was Miguel, the plumber from 3B, who had fixed a burst pipe in my kitchen at 2 a.m. on a Sunday and refused to take a dime because he knew I was a student living on ramen. There was Sarah, the junior designer at Lumen Nest, who had driven me to the emergency room when I had appendicitis and stayed in the waiting room for 6 hours just so I wouldn't wake up alone. There was Mrs. Lee, the owner of the bodega on the corner, who used to save the slightly bruised peaches for me and sell them for pennies because she said they were still sweet inside. None of them were related to me, but all of them had offered me a chair when I was standing. Christmas Eve in San Meridian was not snowy. It was cool and foggy, the city lights glowing through the mist. My apartment was warm, smelling of roasted garlic, rosemary, and the rich tannic scent of good wine. The guests arrived with noise and laughter. Miguel brought his wife and a tray of tamales that smelled like heaven. Sarah brought a salad that looked like a work of art. Mrs. Lee brought a bag of oranges and a bottle of sake. We squeezed around the walnut table. There were 10 of us. The chairs were mismatched, some from the studio, some from my kitchen, some folding chairs borrowed from the hall. But the table leveled everything. I stood at the end of the table to pour the wine. I looked around. No one was waiting for a toast. No one was tapping a glass to demand silence. They were already talking, passing plates, laughing. "So," Miguel said, tearing into a piece of bread. "This is the table? The famous table you have been hammering on for a month?" "This is it," I said, sitting down, not at the head, just at a spot. "It is the prototype." "It is smooth," Mrs. Lee said, rubbing the wood. "Strong, like you, Talia." The conversation drifted, as it always does with good food and good wine, to stories. Sarah started talking about her first Christmas away from home, how she had cried in a laundromat because she didn't have money for a flight back to Vermont. "I felt like such a failure," she said, laughing a little now. "Like I was just taking up space in the city, you know? Like I did not belong." The phrase made me freeze for a second. Taking up space. "I know that feeling," I said quietly. The table went quiet, but it wasn't the tense, judgmental silence of the Monroe dining room. It was a listening silence, a holding silence. "My dad," I said, looking at the grain of the wood under my hand, "told me at Thanksgiving that some kids make you proud, and some kids just take up space. He said it as a toast." Miguel put down his fork. "He said that? To your face?" "To the whole room," I said, and everyone laughed. Mrs. Lee shook her head, her face tightening. "That is not a father. That is a landlord. A father builds the house. He does not charge rent for existing in it." "I left," I said. "I left the dinner, and I came back here, and I finished this table." "Well," Sarah said, raising her glass, "to the table and to the space, you occupy it, Talia. You fill it up. Look at this room. You filled it with people who give a damn." To the table," Miguel echoed. "To the table," everyone shouted. We clinked glasses. The sound was bright, chaotic, and joyous. It was the opposite of the cold. singular cling of my father's spoon. In that moment, Sarah pulled out her phone. "Hold on," she said. "The lighting is perfect. Everyone, look at Talia." I wasn't posing, I was laughing, my head thrown back, passing a bowl of potatoes to Miguel. The warm amber light from the pendant lamp I had designed specifically for this table washed over us. It didn't cast harsh shadows. It didn't spotlight one person. It made us all look golden. The camera flashed. Later that night, after the last guest had left and the dishwasher was humming, I sat on my sofa and looked at the photo Sarah had sent me. It was stunning. It didn't look like a staged holiday card. It looked like a Renaissance painting of a feast. But what struck me most was my face. I looked open. I looked unguarded. I looked like a woman who was exactly where she was supposed to be. I opened Instagram. I usually only posted design sketches or pictures of textures. But tonight, I felt bold. I selected the photo. I typed the caption. I didn't overthink it. I just wrote the truth that had been burning in my chest since November. If they do not give you a seat at the table, build a new one 3,000 miles away. I posted it. I didn't tag Maple Grove. I didn't tag my family. I just let it float out into the digital ether. I went to bed feeling full, warm, and safe. I woke up on Christmas morning to a buzzing phone. The post had taken off. Not just a few likes from friends, but hundreds, then thousands. It had hit a nerve. Strangers were commenting, "Needed to hear this today. Building my own table right now. This is what chosen family looks like." And then, the notification that made my stomach drop. "Brenda Miller shared your post." Brenda, my second cousin, the one who lived 2 towns over from Maple Grove but was active in every single church group, knitting circle, and gossip chain in Ohio. She had added her own commentary. "Is this about Greg?" Oh my. The digital tendril had reached back across the country. It had traveled 3,000 miles in an instant. I could imagine the scene in Maple Grove perfectly. It was Christmas morning. The Monroes would be preparing for church. Dad would be in his suit, checking his phone while Mom fussed with his tie. He would open Facebook, not to look for me, but to check the church group page for the service schedule, or to see who had liked his status update about his blessed life. And there it would be. The photo? I wasn't there to see it, but I knew what he saw. He saw the walnut table. Richer, more elegant, and more modern than his stuffy mahogany antique. He saw the people. Diverse, vibrant, laughing, leaning in toward me. He saw the food. Plentiful and made with love. But mostly, he saw me. He saw the daughter he called invisible, sitting at the head of a table she built with her own hands. He saw the daughter he said took up space occupying the center of a world that looked warmer, happier, and more alive than the sterile museum he presided over. He saw the caption, "If they do not give you a seat at the table, build a new one 3,000 miles away." It wasn't a tantrum. It wasn't a complaint. It was a statement of fact. And the worst part for him, the part that I knew would gnaw at his gut like a rat, was the realization that I wasn't looking at the camera with anger. I wasn't looking at it with defiance. I wasn't thinking about him at all. I was laughing with a plumber and a grocer, and I looked happier than I had ever looked in 32 years of being a Monroe. I set my phone down on the nightstand. I didn't delete the post. I didn't block Brenda. I let it sit there. Let them look. Let them zoom in. Let them wonder who these people were. Let them ask why the girl who took up space seemed to have so much of it now. I got out of bed and walked into the living room. The morning sun was hitting the walnut table, making the steel legs gleam. It was solid. It was real. And it was ready for breakfast. For the first time, I realized that revenge isn't always serving a cold dish. Sometimes, revenge is just eating a really good meal with people who love you, and letting the people who don't starve on the memory of your absence. The call came 3 days after Christmas, shattering the quiet focus of my morning. I was sketching a new joint mechanism for the sanctuary table when my phone buzzed against the drafting board. The number on the screen was a landline from Maple Grove. It wasn't my parents' house number, but it was the area code I had spent 18 years memorizing.
I picked it up, my hand hovering over the accept button for a second. I knew what this was. The digital ripples of my Christmas dinner had finally crashed onto the shores of Ohio. "Hello?" I said, keeping my voice neutral. "You have got some nerve."
There was no greeting, no Merry Christmas, just the low, vibrating anger of Greg Monroe. His voice sounded like it always did when he was losing control of a narrative, tight, clipped, and dangerous.
"Hello, Dad," I said. I set my pencil down. My hand was shaking slightly, a tremor of old fear, but I pressed my palm flat against the cool surface of my desk until it stopped.
"Do not hello dad me," he snapped. "The whole town is talking. Brenda Miller called your mother in tears asking if we had disowned you. The pastor asked me after service if there was discord in the home. Do you have any idea what you have done?"
"I posted a picture of my dinner," I said. "I did not mention you. I did not mention Mom. I did not mention Maple Grove."
"You did not have to," he shouted, the distortion of the phone line cracking his voice. The caption, "Build a new table. If they do not give you a seat, you think people are stupid? You think they do not know exactly who you are talking about? You are making us look like monsters. Talia, like we starved you, like we beat you."
"I never said any of that," I replied, my voice surprisingly steady. "I said I built a table where I fit. If you think that implies you are a monster, maybe you should ask yourself why a simple photo of your daughter being happy feels like an accusation." There was a silence on the line, heavy and breathing. I could hear the background noise of their house, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint sound of the TV in the other room. "It is ungrateful," he hissed. "That is what it is. We gave you everything, a roof, food, an education, and this is how you repay us? By replacing us with strangers? A plumber? A grocer? You think those people care about you? They are nobodies. Talia, they are props in your little drama." "They are my friends," I said, cold fury rising in my chest. "And they gave me something you never did. They gave me a seat without making me beg for it." "You are a child," Greg spat. "A petty, dramatic child who ran away because of a joke. A joke. Talia. Everyone will know. I will tell them. I will tell them you are unstable. That you abandoned your family because you could not take a little teasing." "Let me speak." The voice cut through Greg's tirade like a knife through canvas. It wasn't loud, but it had a weight to it that stopped him mid-breath. It was Grandma Rosemary. "Mom, stay out of this," Greg warned, his voice dropping to a growl. "This does not concern you." "Give me the phone, Greg." There was a scuffle on the line, the sound of plastic fumbling against fabric. My heart hammered against my ribs. Grandma Rosemary never challenged him, not like this. "Talia?" Her voice came through, breathless but clear. "I am here, Grandma." "I saw the picture," she said. "Brenda showed me on her tablet." I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the lecture, for the keep the peace speech. "It is beautiful," she said softly. "The table, it is beautiful. Honey, the wood looks so warm, and the light. Everyone's face is lit up. No one is sitting in the dark. No chair is higher than the other." I felt a lump form in my throat. "Grandma." "I am proud of you," she said, her voice trembling but gaining strength with every word. "You built something real. Do not let him tell you otherwise." "Mom!" Greg's voice was distant but furious. "Stop encouraging her nonsense." "Enough! Greg!" Rosemary snapped. The sharpness of her tone was shocking. It was the voice of the woman who had raised him, not the frail old lady he had been pushing around. "You have controlled the story for too long. You talk and you expect everyone to just nod. Well, I am done nodding." "You are confused," Greg said, his voice closer now, likely leaning over her. "You do not know what you are saying. Give me the phone." "I know exactly what I am saying," Rosemary said, and I could hear the steel in her spine. "You can control my accounts, Greg. You can move my money around and think I do not notice, but you cannot control my mouth, not anymore." The silence that followed was absolute.
It was the sound of a bomb going off in the living room of the Monroe house. She had said it. She had linked the two things, his emotional control and his financial control, in one sentence. "Talia," Grandma said, rushing now, knowing her time was short. "I love you. Your table is good. Keep building." The line went dead with a violent click. I sat there in my studio, the phone still pressed to my ear, the dial tone buzzing like an angry insect. My hands were shaking, but this time it wasn't fear, it was awe. She had stood up, for me, for herself. 5 minutes later, my phone rang again. I expected Greg. I expected rage. But the number was different. It was a mobile number I didn't recognize. "Hello? Talia?" It was Grandma Rosemary again, but her voice was hushed, conspiring. "I am in the bathroom. I locked the door. I am using the prepaid phone the nice lady from the church gave me for emergencies. Greg does not know I have it." "Grandma, are you okay? Is he hurting you?" "He is just shouting," she said dismissively. "Let him shout. He is scared. Talia, he realized I am not as gone as he hopes I am." She took a deep breath. "Listen to me carefully. I saw the papers you looked at. I saw how you organized them on the table before you left. You know, don't you? About the money." "I know," I whispered. "I have copies. Grandma, I have everything." "Good girl," she said. "I knew you were sharp, sharper than him." She paused, and I heard the sound of water running in the sink, likely to mask her voice. "I went to see a lawyer," she said. "A young man, Mr. Henderson. His office is above the bakery. I went when Greg thought I was at physical therapy. I told him I think I made a mistake with the power of attorney. I told him I think I signed things I didn't understand." My grip on the phone tightened. "What did he say?" "He looked at the papers I brought, the ones I hid from Greg. He said it looks irregular. He said if I want to change it, I can, but I need to do it fast, and I need someone I trust to take over."
"Grandma..."
"I want it to be you. Talia," she said firmly. "I want to revoke Greg's power. I want to give it to you, for the money, for the medical decisions, for everything." The weight of her request landed on me. This wasn't just managing bills. This was war. This was stripping Greg of his power in the most public, legal way possible. It would humiliate him. It would destroy whatever facade of family unity was left. "If I do this," I said slowly, "he will never forgive us." "He never forgave you for being born a girl who was smarter than his golden boy," Rosemary said, her voice hard. "And he never forgave me for getting old. We don't need his forgiveness. Talia, we need our dignity."
"Okay," I said. "I will do it."
"Mr. Henderson has the papers drawn up," she said, "but he says he needs you here, in person, to accept the responsibility, to sign as the primary agent, and he wants to do it with Greg present. So there is no claim later that I did it behind his back or that you coerced me." "He wants a confrontation," I said. "He wants it watertight," she corrected. "He says if we do it in the open, Greg can't say I was tricked, but you have to come back. Talia, you have to walk into that house or into that office, and you have to stand next to me while I take the pen out of your father's hand." I looked at the drawing on my desk, the joint mechanism, strong, flexible, able to bear weight. "I can't come back to Maple Grove," I said. "Not to that house, not to his table. If I come back there, he has the home field advantage. He will shout, he will intimidate, he will make you feel small." "Then what do we do?" she asked, her voice faltering slightly. "I can't travel alone. Talia, I am too weak." "Then bring him," I said. An idea was forming, crystalline and sharp. "Tell him you want to visit me. Tell him you want to see the ocean one last time. Tell him you want to settle things with me. He will come if he thinks he can yell at me in person. He will come if he thinks he can bully me into taking down the photo." "You want us to come to California?" "Yes," I said. "Bring him to my turf. Bring him to my table. The one you liked. We will do it here. Mr. Henderson can send the papers to a notary here. We will sign them on the walnut table." "He will hate it,"
she chuckled, a dry, raspy sound. He hates not being the host. Exactly, I said. That is the point. Okay, she said. I will work on him. I will play the frail old lady who just wants her family together. He likes being the hero who grants a dying wish. You are not dying, Grandma, I said fiercely. Not yet, she said. But the old Rosemary is gone. The new one is ready to fight. I will see you soon. Talia, get that table polished. She hung up. I put the phone down. My heart was racing, but my hands were steady. I looked at the blueprint. I picked up my pencil and wrote a note in the margin of the drawing. Load-bearing capacity, infinite. I was going from being the invisible daughter to being the legal guardian of the family's matriarch. I was about to strip the king of his crown, and I was going to do it at a table where he couldn't sit at the head because there wasn't one. I walked over to the walnut table in my living room. I ran my hand along the edge. Get ready, I whispered to the wood. We are going to have company. The phone rang again 24 hours later. This time, Greg Monroe's voice had undergone a cosmetic transformation. Gone was the jagged edge of the tyrant who had screamed about family reputation. In its place was the smooth, reasoned tone of a corporate mediator, the voice he used when he was trying to close a deal that was going south. Talia, he said, the syllables rounded and patient. I have been thinking, we need to de-escalate. Your mother is upset. Grandma is confused. You need to come home. We will sit down, have a nice dinner. Just us. And we will sort through this misunderstanding. We will look at the accounts together. We will clear the air. It was a trap. I could hear the snare drum tightening in the background. If I went back to Maple Grove, back to that mahogany table, the geography of the house would defeat me before I even opened my mouth. I would be the child in the corner seat, and he would be the patriarch at the head, and the weight of 30 years of history would crush the truth. I am not coming to Ohio, I said. Now, Talia, be reasonable. I am being reasonable, I interrupted. I am offering a solution. If you want to talk, if you want to see Grandma and clear the air, you can come here, to San Meridian. California? He scoffed, the mask slipping for a microsecond. That is absurd. Why would we fly across the country when the family home is right here? Because the family is not there anymore, I said. Grandma wants to see the ocean, and I am here. So, here is the deal. You and Mom fly out. We will meet at my apartment. We will sit at my table, and we will talk. I am not playing games, Talia. Neither am I. But those are the terms. If you want to fix this before Mr. Henderson files the paperwork to revoke your power of attorney based on irregularities, then you will get on a plane. There was a long silence. I knew exactly what he was calculating. He was weighing the humiliation of obeying his daughter against the catastrophe of losing control over Rosemary's assets, the money won. Fine, he clipped. We will be there Friday. But this is ridiculous. I will see you Friday. In the days between the call and their arrival, my phone buzzed with a message from Brandon. It was the first time my brother had reached out directly since the Thanksgiving dinner. Brandon, Dad says you are making them fly out there? Bold move. Sis, he is furious. Says you are trying to humiliate him with this magic table of yours. Just a heads up. He is in war mode. I would come to watch the fireworks. But, work. I looked at the screen. Even now, Brandon was hedging his bets. He was curious, maybe even a little impressed. But he wasn't brave enough to witness the toppling of the statue. He preferred to stay in the blast radius of the dad he knew, rather than step into the unknown territory of the sister he didn't. Talia, stay in Ohio. Brandon, this does not concern you. I put the phone away. I had work to do. I prepared my apartment not as a hostess, but as a prosecutor preparing a courtroom. I cleaned with a surgical precision. Every surface was wiped down, every object aligned. I removed the clutter of daily life, the half-read magazines, the coffee mugs, leaving only the essential architecture of the space. On the walls, I hung framed prints of my work, the community center in Oregon,
the library in Seattle, the shelter in Chicago. I wanted them to see that while they were busy dismissing me, I had been busy building worlds they couldn't even imagine. Then, I turned my attention to the table. The American black walnut table stood in the center of the room, anchored by its steel legs. I arranged 3 chairs. I went to the storage closet and pulled out 3 identical dining chairs I had designed for the Lumen Nest project. They were low-backed, upholstered in a neutral gray wool, with light oak legs. I placed one on the north side, one on the west, one on the east. I measured the distance between them, exact, equidistant. No chair was closer to the window. No chair had a better view of the door. No chair was taller. Then, I prepared the documentation. I did not want a shouting match. I wanted an evidentiary hearing. I printed the bank statements I had photographed at Grandma's house. I used a yellow highlighter to mark the unauthorized transfers to Monroe Consulting Group. I used a pink highlighter to mark the payments for the contractor that didn't exist. Next to the financial pile, I placed a second stack of papers. These were emails. Emails I had sent over the last 10 years. Subject: Robotics Finals. Here is the link to watch. No reply. Subject: Dean's List. Thought you might want to know. Reply: Nice. Did Brandon tell you he got promoted? Subject: Job offer at Lumen Nest. I am moving. No reply. I laid them out side by side. The theft of money and the theft of love. 2 different currencies, but the same bankruptcy. When the doorbell rang on Friday evening, the sound was sharp and final. I took a breath, smoothed down my blazer, and opened the door. Greg and Elaine Monroe stood in the hallway. They looked jarringly out of place against the backdrop of the sleek, stucco hallway of my building. They were wearing their heavy Midwest winter coats. Greg in his wool overcoat. Mom in her puffer jacket. Even though it was 65 degrees in San Meridian, they looked flushed, sweaty, and irritated. "We are here," Greg announced, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. He carried his physical presence like a weapon, expecting the room to shrink around him. Mom followed, clutching her purse to her chest. Her eyes darted around the apartment, taking in the high ceilings, the polished concrete floors, the abstract art. "Oh," she said, her voice thin. "It is very modern, isn't it? Very industrial." "It is minimalist," I said. "Let me take your coats." Greg shrugged off his coat and handed it to me without making eye contact. He immediately began scanning the room, looking for a flaw, a crack, something he could criticize to reestablish his dominance. He looked at the baseboards. He looked at the light fixtures. "Rent must be high out here," he grunted. "Hope you are saving, not just burning cash on aesthetics." "I own the apartment, Dad," I said, hanging his coat up. "And the building?" He froze. His back stiffened. He turned slowly to look at me. "You... what?" "I invested early," I said, keeping my face blank. "And my designs pay well. Please, have a seat." I gestured to the table. This was the moment, the choreography I had anticipated. Greg walked toward the walnut table. It was an oval, beautiful and seamless. He walked to the end of the table nearest the kitchen, the position that would typically be the head based on the room's orientation. He pulled out the chair and prepared to sit. Then he paused. He looked to his left. He looked to his right. Because of the oval shape and the positioning of the 3 chairs, the spot he had chosen was not the head, it was just a curve. If he sat there, he would be facing the wall, with me and Mom on his periphery. It was an isolating position, not a commanding one. He frowned. He pushed the chair back in. He walked to the other end. Same problem. The geometry of the table rejected the concept of a focal point. "Where do I sit?" he demanded, frustration leaking into his voice. "Anywhere," I said, standing by the kitchen island, watching him. "The view is the same from every chair." "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "A table needs an orientation." "Only if you need to tell people where to look," I replied. "Here, we just look at each other." He glared at me, his face reddening. He realized he had walked into a trap, but it was a trap made of high-end furniture and geometry, so he couldn't complain without sounding insane. He pulled out the chair on the west side and sat down heavily. "Elaine, sit," he barked. Mom sat on the east side, opposite him. She looked small in the chair, her hands folded on the table, trembling slightly. I walked over and took the chair on the north side. I was now forming the apex of the triangle. I was equidistant from both of them. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence in the room was thick, heavier than the air in the Maple Grove dining room had ever been. There was no turkey to carve. There was no wine to pour. There was just the three of us, the smooth expanse of the walnut table, and the stack of papers resting under my hand. Greg placed his hands on the table. He tried to do his signature finger tap, but the wood was solid, dense. It didn't make the hollow, rattling sound he was used to. It absorbed the impact. "All right," he said, trying to summon his boardroom voice. "We are here. We are sitting at your table now. Tell me what this is about, and tell me why you have poisoned your grandmother against me." I didn't answer immediately. I slid the stack of papers into the center of the table. I fanned them out slightly, so the yellow and pink highlighter marks caught the light of the pendant lamp above us. "We are not here to talk about Grandma's feelings," I said, my voice calm, devoid of the tremor that used to define my speech in his presence. "We are here to talk about math, and we are here to talk about memory." I looked at Mom. She was staring at the papers, her eyes widening as she recognized the bank logos. Then I looked at Dad. "And in this house," I said, "no one sits higher than anyone else, so for the first time, you are going to have to look me in the eye, not down your nose." Greg looked at the papers. He saw the sum, $15,000, highlighted in yellow. He saw the date. He saw his own handwriting on the note I had scanned. The color drained from his face, replaced by a gray, ash-like pallor. He looked up at me, and for the first time in 32 years, the look in his eyes wasn't boredom, and it wasn't disappointment. It was fear. "Shall we begin?" I asked. I did not start with the bank statements. I did not start with the $15,000 missing from Grandma's account or the forged signature on the deed transfer. I knew that if I led with the crime, Greg would immediately retreat into his lawyer persona. He would deny, deflect, and bury me in jargon. I needed to start with the wound. I sat back in my chair, resting my hands on the cool walnut surface. The silence in the room was heavy, amplified by the vast, open space of the loft. "Do you remember my 10th birthday?" I asked. Greg blinked, thrown off by the change in trajectory. "What? We are here to discuss your grandmother. Talia, stop living in the past." "Just answer the question," I said softly. "Do you remember it?" Elaine shifted in her chair. She looked down at her hands. "We had a party," she murmured. "We had cake." "We had a muffin," I corrected her. "A chocolate chip muffin from the gas station on the way home from Brandon's practice. You forgot to order a cake. You forgot it was the 14th until I came downstairs and asked if I could open a present. Dad gave me a $10 bill from his wallet and told me to buy something nice." I looked at Greg. He was staring at the wall, his jaw tight. "And do you remember Brandon's 10th birthday?" I continued. "The year before? We rented the bouncy castle. You invited the entire Pee Wee League. Dad, you spent $400 on fireworks. You stood on the back deck and gave a speech about how your boy was hitting double digits." "Money was tight when you turned 10, Greg said, his voice defensive. "The market was down. We did the best we could." "Money was tight?" I repeated. "Dad, you bought a new boat 3 weeks after my birthday. It wasn't about the money, it was about the investment. You invested in what you thought would give you a return. Brandon was a stock that was going up. I was just overhead." "You are being dramatic," Greg scoffed. "You always were. Too sensitive. Too quiet. You sat in that garage and judged us." "I sat in the garage because it was the only place I wasn't in the way," I said. "And that is the point, isn't it? That is the narrative you wrote for me. The extra. The burden. The one who takes up space." I reached for my phone.
It was sitting face down on the table. I flipped it over. "I want you to listen to something," I said. I pressed play. The sound that filled the San Meridian apartment was crisp and horrifyingly clear. It was the ambient noise of the Maple Grove dining room, the scrape of forks against china, the murmur of polite conversation. And then, Greg's voice, booming and confident. "Some kids, they go out there and they make you proud. And then, some kids just take up space." Then came the laughter, Brandon's bark, the nervous titters of the cousins. In the recording, it sounded like a party, but in my quiet living room, with the three of us sitting in a triangle, it sounded like an execution. I let it play until the end, until my recorded voice said, "Mais is con vous se song mot kaiban." No, I had spoken English then. It is lucky that I just built a table of my own. I hit pause. The silence that followed was suffocating. Elaine had a hand over her mouth, tears leaking from the corners of her eyes. Greg was staring at the phone as if it were a venomous snake. "It was a joke," Greg muttered, but the bluster was gone. He sounded small. "It was a roast. We were having fun." "It wasn't a joke," I said. "It was your philosophy. You have treated me like a squatter in my own life for 30 years, and the problem is, you started treating Grandma the same way." I pushed the stack of papers toward him. "You decided she was just taking up space, too," I said. "You decided she didn't need that money. You decided her memory was going, so why not help yourself? You decided she was past due, just like those bills on her table." Greg looked at the papers. He saw the highlighted transfers. He saw the dates. "She gave me permission," he said, his voice rising, trying to find traction. "She told me to handle the accounts. She said, 'Greg, take care of it. I moved the money to protect it, to invest it.'" "You moved it to Monroe Consulting," I said, "an LLC that lists you as the sole beneficiary, and you did it on November 2nd. 2 days after Grandma fell and was on high-dose painkillers, I checked the medical records. Dad, she wasn't lucid enough to authorize a pizza delivery, let alone a $15,000 transfer." Greg slammed his hand on the table. "I am her son. I have taken care of her for 20 years while you were out here playing artist. I drove her to the doctors. I mowed her lawn. I earned that money." "You didn't earn it," I said, my voice hard as steel. "You stole it. Because you felt entitled to it. Because you think anyone who isn't you is just a resource to be mined." I looked at Mom. She was weeping openly now, her shoulders shaking. "Did you know?" I asked her. Elaine sobbed. "I saw the letters. I saw she was upset. But Greg said he was handling it. He said she was getting dementia. He said if I questioned him, I was betraying the family." "You watched him gaslight his own mother," I said, not sparing her. "Just like you watched him diminish me. You stayed silent to keep the peace, Mom. But there is no peace. There is just him, eating everything at the table until there is nothing left for the rest of us." "I am sorry," she wailed. "I am so sorry, Talia." Greg looked at his wife, disgusted by her weakness. Then he looked at me. He looked at the evidence spread out on the walnut table. He realized there was no way out. The geometry of the room gave him no shadows to hide in. He slumped back in his chair. The king had lost his crown. "I was afraid," he said. The words were so quiet I almost missed them. "What?" I asked. "I was afraid," Greg repeated, staring at his hands. Brandon is simple. I give him a ball. He throws it. I tell him he's great. He believes me. He makes me feel like a giant, like a father." He looked up at me, and his eyes were hollow. "But you," he said. "You were always watching, even when you were 5. You had those eyes. You analyzed everything. You fixed things I couldn't fix. You built things I didn't understand. You made me feel stupid. You made me feel small. And I hated you for it." The confession hung in the air. It wasn't an apology. It was an autopsy of his own ego. He had tried to erase me because my existence threatened his fragile sense of superiority. I felt a wave of sadness, but it wasn't for me.
It was for him. It was for the small, scared man who had spent a lifetime building a fortress out of trophies and bluster because he was terrified of his own daughter. "That is the truth," I said. "Finally." I stood up. I walked to the kitchen counter and picked up a heavy bound document. I walked back and placed it in the center of the table, right on top of the bank statements. "I am not going to call the police," I said. "I am not going to call the IRS. I am not going to put you in jail, Dad, because that would destroy Mom, and it would kill Grandma." Greg looked at the document, revocation of power of attorney and establishment of joint guardianship. "This," I said, "is the new rule." I tapped the paper. "This grants me full joint power of attorney over all of Grandma's assets. It requires 2 signatures for any withdrawal over $100, mine and yours. It grants me full access to her medical records, and it stipulates that every cent you took, every single penny of that $40,000 you invested, will be paid back into her account within 6 months. We will call it a loan. We will set up a payment plan." Greg stared at the document. "And if I don't sign?" "Then I send the copies on this table to the district attorney in Ohio," I said. "And I send the recording of you admitting to earning her money while she was drugged to the judge, and you go to prison for elder abuse and fraud." I leaned forward, placing my hands flat on the table, looking him dead in the eye. "I am not asking for a seat at your table anymore. Dad, I am setting the table. And these are the manners we are going to use. You are going to treat her with dignity. You are going to treat me with respect, not because you want to, but because if you don't, I will dismantle your life with the same precision I used to build this furniture." Elaine looked up, wiping her eyes. She looked at the document, then at Greg. "Sign it, Greg," she whispered. "Please, before it is too late." Greg looked at the pen I had placed next to the document. It was a heavy metal pen. He looked at the walnut table, the table I had built, the table that didn't wobble, the table that had no head. He realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't the one holding the carving knife. He was just another guest, and he had to follow the rules of the house. He reached for the pen. His hand was shaking. "This is blackmail," he muttered, but there was no heat in it. "No," I said. "It is a boundary, and it is 3,000 miles wide." He uncapped the pen. The sound was a sharp click in the silent room. He bent over the paper. His posture slumped, looking older than I had ever seen him. I watched him. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel joy. I felt a profound sense of relief. The ghost in the garage was gone. The girl who took up space was gone. In her place stood a woman who had just negotiated the terms of her own freedom. Greg hesitated. His hand hovered over the heavy metal pen, his fingers twitching as if the instrument were scorching hot. He pulled back, shaking his head, and the old Greg Monroe, the one who ruled Maple Grove with a terrifying mixture of silence and bluster, tried to claw his way back to the surface. "I cannot do this," he said, his voice thickening with a sense of righteous victimhood. "This is a betrayal. A daughter does not corner her father in a strange apartment and force him to sign away his rights. A daughter does not hold a gun to the head of the family." "It is not a gun, Dad," I said, my voice calm. "It is a mirror. You just do not like what you see in it." "I will not sign," he spat, pushing the chair back. The wood legs screeched against the polished concrete floor, a harsh sound that made Mom flinch. "I am leaving. You can take your little recording and your stolen documents and do whatever you want. I will fight you in court. I will tell the judge you coerced me." "I thought you might say that," I said. I did not stand up. I did not block the door. I simply reached for my laptop, which was sitting closed on the kitchen island behind me. I brought it to the table, opened it, and placed it squarely in the center of the walnut oval. I hit a key. The screen flickered to life, the video call connecting instantly. "Grandma?" I said. The image resolved. Grandma Rosemary was sitting in her armchair in Ohio, wearing her best Sunday blouse, the one with the pearl buttons. She looked tired, her skin like parchment paper, but her eyes were alert. She was holding the phone I had called earlier, but now she was looking into the camera of the tablet Mrs. Miller had set up for her.
"I am here, Talia," she said. Her voice was tinny coming through the laptop speakers, but it filled the room.
Greg froze. He stared at the screen. He saw his mother, not the confused, fading woman he had been telling everyone she was, but the matriarch who had taught him how to tie his shoes.
"Mom?" he whispered.
"Hello, Greg?" Rosemary said. She did not smile. "I heard you shouting. You always did shout when you were losing an argument." "They are tricking you, Mom," Greg pleaded, leaning toward the screen. "Talia is manipulating you. She is trying to take control."
"Talia is doing exactly what I asked her to do."
Rosemary cut in. Her voice was weak, lacking the lung power of her youth, but the steel was there.
"I asked her to help me because you stopped helping me. Greg, you started helping yourself."
"I was protecting the assets."
"You were protecting your ego," Rosemary said.
"Greg, I have let you sit at the head of the table for too long, since your father died. I let you take that chair. I thought it made you feel like a man. I thought it made you feel important. But you did not use that chair to lead. You used it to rule. You used it to decide who mattered and who did not." She paused, taking a ragged breath. I watched Greg's face. He looked like a child who had been caught stealing from the collection plate.
"I am tired of that table, Greg,"
Rosemary continued.
"I want a new one. I want a table where everyone is equal, where I am not just a checkbook to you,
where Talia is not just a nuisance. I want to sit at a table where I can look you in the eye." Greg stared at the two women he had spent his life minimizing: his mother, whom he had dismissed as senile; his daughter, whom he had dismissed as invisible. He looked at me, sitting across from him, unwavering. He looked at his mother on the screen, resolute. He realized, in that terrified silence, that the hierarchy he had worshipped was an illusion. The power had shifted. The two supporting characters in the movie of his life had taken over the director's chair. He slumped. The fight went out of him like air leaving a punctured tire. He looked at his hands. He looked lost.
"I just wanted," he started, his voice cracking.
"I just wanted us to be a successful family." "We are a successful family, Greg." Mom spoke up. We all turned to her. Elaine had been a statue for most of the night, weeping silently. Now, she wiped her face with the back of her hand. She looked at her husband with a mixture of pity and exhaustion.
"But we are not a happy one," she whispered.
She reached out and placed her hand over his on the table.
"Sign it, Greg," she said softly. "Please, I do not want our daughter to live in a world where she has to ask permission to exist anymore, and I do not want to live in a world where I have to ask permission to love her."
It was the apology I had waited 30 years to hear. It wasn't perfect. It was late, but it was real. Greg looked at Elaine. He saw the fatigue in her eyes, the years of walking on eggshells he had scattered. He looked at the document. He picked up the pen. The pendant lamp above us cast an even golden glow. There were no shadows on the paper. There was no head of the table to cast a silhouette over the signature line. He signed, Gregory A. Monroe. The sound of the pen scratching against the paper was quiet, just a friction of ink and fiber. But to me, it sounded like the slamming of a heavy iron door. It was the sound of the past being locked away. He capped the pen and pushed the document toward me. "Are you happy?" he asked, his voice hollow. I looked at the signature. Grandma Rosemary was safe. Her money was safe. My dignity was safe.
"I am not happy, Dad," I said honestly,
"but I can breathe." I picked up the document. I looked at the screen. "It is done, Grandma," I said. "Good," she sighed, closing her eyes for a moment. "Now, I am going to have a cup of tea. And Greg, when you come back to Ohio, do not come to my house until you are ready to apologize. Not to me, to your daughter." She ended the call. The screen went black. The dinner, or the trial, was over. We had not eaten. The beautiful table was covered in evidence, not food, but I felt full. I stood up. "I will call you a cab to the airport."
We have a rental, Greg mumbled, standing up. He looked smaller in his coat now. The swagger was gone. I walked them to the door. The hallway of my building was quiet. Greg stepped out, but he paused at the threshold. He looked back at the apartment, at the walnut table glowing under the light. "I will not be coming back to Maple Grove for Christmas," I said. "I will not be sitting at that mahogany table again. That part of my life is over." I looked at both of them. "But," I said, softening my tone just a fraction, "if you want to see me, or if you want to see Grandma, this table is here. It always has room. As long as no one uses it to measure who is worth more than anyone else, that is the only rule." Greg looked at me. He opened his mouth to argue, to negotiate, to find some way to have the last word, but he stopped. He nodded. It was a jerky, hesitant nod, but it was an acknowledgement. He didn't promise to change overnight. He didn't promise to be a new man, but he accepted the condition. He walked down the hall. Mom stayed for a second. She reached out and grabbed my hand. Her grip was tight, her fingers trembling. She didn't say anything. She just squeezed my hand, hard, transmitting a message of regret and relief that words couldn't carry. Then she turned and followed him. I closed the door. I locked it. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood of the door frame and let out a long, shuddering breath. I didn't cry. I didn't cheer. I just stood there, feeling the silence of my apartment. It wasn't a lonely silence anymore. It was a peaceful one. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in January, 2 movers from Lumen Nest arrived at my apartment. They wrapped the walnut table in thick moving blankets and carried it down the stairs. I followed them, carrying the box of gray chairs. We drove to the new community center in downtown San Meridian. It was a beautiful space, reclaimed from an old textile factory, filled with skylights and exposed brick. We placed the table in the center of the main atrium. It was the heart of the room. By noon, the center was open. I stood by the entrance and watched. An elderly man, a retired veteran who lived in the subsidized housing next door, walked in. He looked hesitant, scanning the room for danger, for rejection. He saw the table. He saw the curve of the wood, the way it invited him in without demanding he take a specific side. He sat down. A few minutes later, a young girl, maybe 19, with pink hair and a heavy backpack, walked in. She looked like she had been sleeping rough. She saw the man. She saw the empty chair across from him, not above him, not below him, but with him. She sat down. Then a young mother with a toddler. Then a businessman on his lunch break. They didn't know each other. They didn't share blood, but they shared the space. The veteran started talking to the girl. The businessman made a face at the toddler. There was no head of the table. There was no one tapping a spoon to interrupt them. There was just connection. I walked over to the table. I placed my hand on the smooth surface, right on the spot where my father had signed the papers. I couldn't feel the indentation of the pen, but I knew it was there. It was part of the history of the wood now. I realized then that the revenge I had sought wasn't about hurting Greg. It wasn't about humiliating him. It was about this. It was about proving that the scarcity he believed in was a lie. He thought there was only enough space for one person to shine. He thought someone had to be small for someone else to be big. He was wrong. I looked at the people sitting there, bathed in the warm light. I had built a world 3,000 miles away from Maple Grove, where no one had to ask permission to take up space. I turned to leave, buttoning my coat against the cool January wind. I walked out into the San Meridian sun, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was walking away from something. I felt like I was walking toward everything. I was entirely, completely free, and I didn't need anyone to nod from the head of the table to tell me it was okay to go. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are listening from. So please comment below and let's share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Lila Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit the hype button to help this story reach more people who might need to hear it.